Hello, folks. We're about to launch our webinar. We'll begin in just a minute as we wait for more people to enter into the Zoom room. Thanks. Welcome, everyone. We're still waiting for a few people to come in, but we're about to start our proceedings here. Welcome to the University of Colorado. My name is Laisha Palin, and I am a faculty member in the Department of Information Science. During the academic year, the Department of Information Science offers a weekly colloquium. This year, our series has focused on a range of themes with respect to data politics. Today, we are proud to be co-hosting this event with the Center of Research, Data, and Digital Scholarship. In just a moment, my colleague Thea Lindquist will introduce Professor Lauren Klein, who has drawn such a large audience that we have had to happily adapt our proceedings just a bit. We ask that you suggest questions of our speaker via the Google form we list on the bit.ly link on the slide here. Jordan Werfs-Brock and Samantha Dalal, PhD students in information science, will be moderating the questions for Professor Klein at the end of her talk. This link will also be posted in chat throughout the talk as a reminder to you. Finally, we would like to acknowledge Sarah Mandos from Information Science and Cindy Edgar from CRDDS for their Herculean efforts working behind the scenes to make this exciting webinar happen. Many thanks to them and many thanks to you, our wide audience, for your participation in this talk today. I now turn things over to Thea Lindquist, Director of CRDDS.
Thanks, Laisha. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Lauren Klein. She's an associate professor in the departments of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods at Emory University, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. Before moving to Emory, she taught in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. Professor Klein works at the intersection of digital humanities, data science, and early American literature, with a research focus on issues of gender and race. She's designed platforms for exploring the contents of digital newspapers, modeled the invisible labor of women abolitionists, and recreated forgotten visualization schemes with fabric and addressable LEDs. In 2017, she was named one of the rising stars in digital humanities by Inside Higher Ed. She's an author of An Archive of Taste, Race and Eating in the Early US, University of Minnesota Press, 2020, and with Catherine D'Ignazio, Data Feminism, MIT Press, 2020. With Matthew K. Gold, she edits Debates in the Digital Humanities, a hybrid print digital publication stream that explores debates in the field as they emerge. Her current project, Data by Design, an interactive history of data visualization, 1786 to 1900, was recently funded by an NEH Mellon Fellowship for Digital Publication. It is with great pleasure that I turn the screen over to Professor Lauren Klein for her presentation today on data feminism.
Thanks so much, Thea. And thanks so much, Laisha, for both of you for your invitation and having me here, and Cindy and Sarah for your technical orchestration, and Jordan and Samantha in advance for your facilitation of the session later. I was saying before, it's really, even though I'm very sad that I can't be there in person because I love Boulder, it's nice to be with you virtually because I have some really close friends who teach at CU, and this makes me feel like I'm participating in your community a tiny little bit. I am going to share my screen here. Let's move this over. Okay, oops. Okay. I think I can see. Does that look good to people? Okay, sounds good. So what I'm going to do is talk to you for hopefully not all of the hour about this book called Data Feminism that I co-authored with Catherine D'Ignazio, whose picture you can see right up here. She couldn't be here today, but she is with us in spirit. And I did want to mention that MIT Press actually has made the book open access online. So if you're curious about things that you hear about today, you can go to this URL down here, and you can click some links and then find the open access version of the book. So I thought what I would begin by doing is talking a little bit about our motivation, Catherine and my motivation for writing the book, before I get into some specific examples of sort of what we mean when we say data feminism. So Catherine and I see data feminism as part of a larger and growing body of work that is together working to hold corporate and government actors accountable for their sexist, racist, and classist data products. So you could think of things like face detection systems that can't see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, child abuse detection algorithms that punish poor parents, and more. And at the bottom of the screen, you can actually see some of the projects that have done work on these specific issues, and that really inspired us to pull a lot of them together in the book. Because what really was driving us was the fact that these examples just keep on coming. Whereas corporations see data as the new oil, we've heard this phrase a lot, and they actually mean this in a good way. Data seems to them this sort of untapped natural resource that can lead to profit for them once processed and refined. Women, and particularly women of color, but also Indigenous people, immigrant communities, LGBTQ folks, and more, experience this very same process of data extraction, because actually, if you're talking about oil, that's actually the better metaphor. It's really just another example of the same old oppression. And we're not the first ones to have made the case that this oppression is real, that it's ongoing, and that it's necessary to dismantle. And what we actually try to do in the book is explain how feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, has actually been precisely focused on this for a very long time. Dismantling instances of oppression and the sort of what I'll talk about a little bit more as forces of power that cause these instances of oppression. This is the work that feminism has been doing for a very long time. Just before I get into things, I just want to connect this to some things that have been going on pretty recently. So, speaking out against the same old oppression carries consequences. People here may or may not have heard of this recent issue with respect to Dr. Timnit Gebru, who is until recently the co-lead of the ethical artificial intelligence team at Google. Dr. Gebru, PhD in CS, is known for her scholarship in machine vision, as well as her work on DEI issues in the field of AI. She was one of the co-founders of Black in AI, a community for Black researchers in AI. And there was this situation where leadership at Google had approved a paper that she and her team had been working on for months, and then suddenly reversed their decision and told the team to retract the paper. This was all like in the past month, maybe 6 weeks. I don't know, time is very weird here, but recent. So Dr. Gebru asked for more transparency about the decision, along with more answers about the many, many diversity, the sort of DEI initiatives that Google leadership had dragged their feet on, and they just fired her with no more information than that. This treatment is shameful and silencing, and yet Catherine and some of her colleagues at MIT, Dr. Caitlin Turner and Danielle Wood, they've recently written this paper about how even this is not an isolated case, right? There is a centuries-old playbook that is used against women, and Black women in particular, who attempt to do this work of speaking out against oppression, speaking truth to power. But the question sort of remains, like, why does this case of Dr. Gebru matter for AI research and sort of data science more broadly? And as we say in the first chapter of our book, feminism really teaches us to ask questions which can sometimes make people uncomfortable. Questions about who is doing the work of data science and who is left out, whose goals are prioritized in data science and whose are not, and who benefits from data science and who is overlooked, or in the case of Dr. Gebru, actively, professionally, and personally harmed. And these questions, I call them uncomfortable because they point to the fact that there are certain groups of people who disproportionately benefit from data science, and there are certain groups of people who are disproportionately harmed. And then there's a sort of a secondary question, which is, how do these questions relate to feminism? And so before I really dig into the contents of the book, I just want to do some level setting about how Catherine and I understand the term and how we use it in the book. So what you've actually been looking at in this slide is an image from the 2014 MTV Music Awards. That's Beyonce up there, and she projected the words, obviously you're staring at it, feminist behind her. This is because she sings about feminism in a song called Flawless, and she samples what turns out to be the American Heritage Dictionary definition of the term. The sample is actually sort of a more interesting kind of literary history. It comes from a speech made by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. So you can imagine Adichie saying in the Beyonce song, feminist, the person who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. So what we get from this definition is that at its core, feminism is a belief in equality. The dictionary also gives a second definition, which is organized activity on behalf of women's and non-binary people's rights and interests. So feminism also means political action. And then feminism has a third definition, which is a set of theories and ideas. These theories began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender, but the past 40 years of scholarship and just sort of like the political reality have brought many, many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation. So these include race, these include class, these include sexuality, ability, and more. So this sort of brings me back around to this idea of intersectional feminism. And in our view and what we say in the book is that feminism in the year 2021, our future space year, feminism must be understood as intersectional. And again, some of you may know this already, but I think that again, it's helpful just for sort of establishing some common ground. Intersectionality is a term coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. And she uses it to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference, like gender. So when we're talking about inequality or oppression, we must be talking about the intersection of the many factors and forces that produce it. So these include racism, classism, colonialism, and so on. So the key thing to understand about intersectionality, and I want to highlight this because it's actually a thing that's often overlooked in casual invocations of the term, is that intersectionality doesn't just describe markers of individual identity. So it doesn't just mean like, I am a white cisgender woman who lives in the US South, in the global North, these sort of markers of identity, right? It doesn't just describe those. It describes the structural forces of power and their intersection that produce the effects that people experience as a result of those identities. And it's really the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have foregrounded this conversation about forces of power, about the root cause of the issues that we face in the world today. And in today's world, data really is power. You see this in the idea of data as the new oil, and you also see this in the idea of data as the same old oppression. And so intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help that power be challenged and changed. So our basic argument is that data science needs feminism and intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances. And so in writing the book, Catherine and I, we sort of sat down where we were on Zoom, or it wasn't Zoom, it was like Skype back then, it was pre-COVID. But we worked remotely and we scheduled some chats and we asked ourselves, what had we learned from all of our schooling in feminist scholarship, our participation in various activist communities and community groups. And we came up with these 7 principles that to us encapsulated the most important aspects of feminism as they relate to data. And our goal with these principles was to operationalize feminism for data science, to provide concrete models that might guide the work of people working with data, or who want to work with data, or who want to refuse to work with data. For various reasons. And so in the book, we have one chapter devoted to each of these principles, where we bring up a lot of different examples that help illustrate what we mean when we say each of these things: examine power, challenge power, rethink binaries and hierarchies, elevate emotion and embodiment, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. Now in the talk, I don't really have enough time to go through each of these principles one by one. And so what I've tried to do is pick some examples that bring together multiple principles in a single example. And I'm going to work through a couple of them so you get a sense of what we mean by this idea of operationalizing feminism, which I think some people hear and think like, isn't that instrumentalizing? Isn't this sort of reducing what this work is trying to do? But what we try to explain in the book, we're trying to make these theories and these principles sort of actionable and applicable to real world issues that people face in their everyday lives. So one of the first projects we talk about in the book is this one. It's called The Library of Missing Data Sets. It's by the artist and educator Mimi Onuoha. And this idea of missing data sets, the term that Onuoha uses, she employs to describe data sets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need. But because of various reasons, and bracket that, we'll come back to those reasons in a minute, they don't actually exist in real life. So her list includes things like data sets, like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime. Here's my daughter saying hello. Not on her list, but more topical. You might think of a gender and race breakdown of people getting COVID vaccines right now in the US. There's actually been some coverage in the past week, maybe, about how people know that there are disparities in terms of who's getting access to these vaccines for a number of factors that you can probably imagine, but they're only collecting data that documents this problem for about half of the population. So for half of the places in the country, we know these inequities are being played out, but we don't know anything more about them. Just a couple more things to note about the project. So it actually exists in 2 forms. The first is a GitHub repository. That's actually what you see on the right. That's just a screenshot. And if you Google Library of Missing Data Sets, Onuoha, GitHub, you'll find it. But then there's also a physical art installation, and that's the file cabinet that you see on the left. The files are labeled with the titles of each of the missing data sets. And the idea is you enter the gallery, you sort of tab through the file folders, you might find one that looks interesting to you. And you go to open it up because you think, hey, I want to learn more about this, but it's empty. And again, the reason why it's empty is because of the profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So this is this imbalance of power that determines what data are collected and what data are not, or even what research is conducted and what is not. Governments have this power, moneyed institutions have this power, minoritized groups do not. And this is why, as we say in the book, a lot, because it's really important. A feminist approach to data science begins with an analysis of power, because far too often, the data that we can access, and then in turn, the questions that they prompt have already been overdetermined by the imbalances of power that exist in the world. So this second example, which shows feminicides in Mexico, which actually not unique to Mexico, but is another case of missing data. So in the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero. She is a woman who resolved to head straight towards this problem of missing data and collect it herself. So Just a little bit of context, feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They include both cis and trans women. They are legally defined as crimes in a handful of countries, including Mexico, but the state does not systematically collect data on these crimes. They're actually also the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America. And if you're interested, you can check out the hashtag that we have on the bottom of the slide, Ni Una Menos. And they're a subject of public anger because the state neglects to fully implement its own laws and provisions. Because they don't know where these crimes are happening and to whom they are happening, even though there are laws on the books, they cannot be enforced. Now, Maria Salguero was really frustrated by this lack of action, and she has single-handedly, over the past 5+ years, compiled what turns out to be the largest archive of feminicides in Mexico. She spends 2 to 4 hours per day logging feminicides on a Google map that she calls from media reports. She's helped families locate loved ones. She's provided these data to journalists and NGOs, and actually has been called to testify in front of Mexico's Congress because of the work that she is doing. And this is something that we might call feminist counter data. So this is sort of activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And it represents one way to use data to challenge power. And there's more to say about how more data is not always the answer. And we can talk about that a little bit later, but for now, in the interest of time, I'll just sort of leave it there. In the book, we also talk about, there's sort of a theme in these examples of sort of counter data collection efforts like this one, undertaken by San Francisco's anti-eviction mapping project. They've been actually, that's what you see here. Hang on a sec. There's a situation with milk in the fridge. My daughter is texting me. Okay, I'm just gonna text her back. Life intervening. Okay, so counter data, the AEMP, that's what they call themselves. Worked this project a very long time. And what they do is they work in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups in order to collect and map data about the eviction crisis in the Bay Area. And evictions, I think, again, these are sort of issues that may be familiar to those of you in sort of tech and tech adjacent fields, but because of Silicon Valley, rents in the Bay Area are ridiculous, and they push out people who are not tech workers, or at least not a particular kind of tech workers. And so the AEMP has been trying to document this. And what you see on this map are, with the red dots, they indicate a place where a person or a family was evicted. And then the blue dots indicate places where the AEMP has also interviewed one of the people who was evicted to that place. So clicking on one of the dots brings up one of these video interviews. That's what they are, like the one that you see on the right. That's of a Midtown resident named Phyllis Bowie. And in the book, we contrast the AEMP map with the work of the Eviction Lab, which is based at Princeton University. And the Eviction Lab's goal is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. And, which again, like is and I should say at the outset, this is an incredibly worthy goal, especially with COVID. This project is immensely valuable. But the contrast comes in terms of process, where the AEMP and the Eviction Lab are wildly different. So, you take a look at this map and you think, okay, I'm looking at bigger data, right? Here it is, map of the entire United States. You might even think like, okay, they're using Mapbox or something. I'm not entirely sure what mapping framework they're using, but it sort of looks a little bit more official. You seem to think that you're looking at a more comprehensive picture of the problem of eviction in the United States. But what the AEMP has shown is that national real estate databases, like the ones that the Eviction Lab uses, significantly undercount evictions. And you can think again about the reasons why this might be true. First of all, the real estate industry not super invested in overcounting any more evictions than they have to. You can think about especially students, like I feel like many of us have been in this situation. Yes, you can use the whole milk. All of the different ways in which you can be sort of in effect evicted without actually being served with a legal eviction paper, like not fixing, like the landlord not fixing the leak in your ceiling, or lurking in the lobby, or using their key to enter your apartment. All these ways are ways of getting you out that don't get recorded in the official go to City Hall, file the paperwork for the eviction, deliver the notice, right? But because the AEMP works with local communities and tenants' rights organizations, so the organizations where people come when they say, help me, this is happening to me, and then the AEMP converts that into data, they've gathered sort of admittedly messier, but actually much more accurate and more contextualized data that documents a greater extent of the problem at hand. And in the book, we talk about this in terms of what is gained by embracing pluralism, bringing many different voices to the table. So just a quick note about this. So when we're embracing pluralism in the process of doing data science, we can't practically or realistically bring everyone's voice to the table. So the question remains sort of whose voices do we prioritize? And some people can sort of wring their hands about this, but feminists actually have a very clear answer to this. So following the work of folks like Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, more recently in HCI, Xiaowen Bartzel, a feminist design perspective takes power into account and deliberately centers the experience of people at the edges and margins first and foremost. And you sort of make decisions from the outside in. And we have a quote here from the Design Justice Network, which is another really great resource. That says, quote, "We center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process." And the same is true for the design of data science projects. So these are the folks we should be working hard to build relationships with. Okay. So the past set of examples have really focused on the issue of power and people, sort of like the people who have power and the people who don't. But another major idea that comes from feminism relates to what theorists call structures of power, and more specifically, binary structures, meaning that they're structures that are defined by a hard distinction between two groups. Now, feminist theory over the course of many, many years has helped to show how these binary distinctions are usually hiding a hierarchy, with one group on top and the other on the bottom. And once you see the hierarchy, you start to understand why the hard line between those groups is there in the first place. It's there to ensure that one group stays on the top and the other on the bottom, and that there's sort of no travel between them. So if you want to think the obvious reference point, it's this distinction between the idea of man and woman, right? Because it's a clear example both of a false binary and an unequal hierarchy, right? There are more than two genders, and among them, no one gender is better than any of the others. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists, and you can think of feminist theory in general and feminist STS work in particular, is to take this critique of the gender binary and use it to question other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So in effect, to abstract this critique, to sort of identify places where there's sort of this hierarchical binary with one on top and one on the bottom, and first to sort of reorient them so that they're, I'm putting this around my body so you can see, so that they are no longer in a hierarchy, and then to collapse them so that they're no longer defined by this hard distinction between two things. And so you can see this idea of sort of abstracting this critique of binary structures being applied to all sorts of artificial distinctions that we encounter in the world. So the distinction between nature and culture is a big one. That's why feminists love the cyborg. Subject and object, you can think about this in any sort of educational research, like who is teacher, who is student. There should not be such a hard distinction. Or the one that this example takes up, which is the artificial distinction between reason and emotion. So in my Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in data and data visualization in particular all the time. So best practices for viz often involve like a clean design, a minimalist aesthetic, presenting just the facts. But the question remains, why are these our best practices? Especially when research has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices just as emotionally. So we tend to believe that these types of charts, these sort of minimal factual seeming ones, are actually more truthful than they really are. So you can think of research by folks like Jessica Holman, who has shown that just including a source line below a data visualization makes a person trust it more. It doesn't matter whether that credit line actually points to a real URL. People, folks like Helen Kennedy in the UK has done good research about the rhetoric of visualization, showing that sort of maximalist visualizations actually more memorable and convey information better than what best practices would lead us to believe. But I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion. So sort of take this idea of what we should be doing or what should be excluded from data visualization and turn it on its head. And that's what the example here helps us explore. So what you've been looking at is actually screenshots of an animated visualization. It's by the design firm Periscopic, and actually you can, if you feel like Googling it and watching it while I'm talking, that's totally fine. You'll get a better sense of what I'm actually talking about anyway. But if not, I'll describe it. So it's this animated visualization of the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in a particular calendar year. They did 2010, 2013, and more recently 2018. And what you see on the screen is each of the people being killed by a gun in that year represented as a single arc. That's what you see in the smaller little black screenshot. The arcs, they're traced one by one on the screen. They start out pretty slow so you can read the information about each person. And then they get faster and faster until they create the sort of semicircular web that you're looking at in a larger image. You know, I find it really overwhelming to watch, like really unbearable. You know, you think it should be done and it's not done and it keeps on going and you just think like, why isn't this stopping? But that is the point, right? There are too many people being killed by guns in the United States.
Is this smell okay?
I'm not sure. You need to ask Dada to smell the milk.
It says it expires on March 3rd.
And then it's probably fine. Yeah, so the point is that there's too many people being killed by guns in the United States. The visualization sort of goes on for too long, and you could even think about it in terms of design principles, right? So what you're looking at in the larger image is something called occlusion, right? Where you can't actually, there's too much data plotted on the chart, so you can't actually see what any individual data point is showing you. The same thing is actually true for the AEMP map as well. But again, this is sort of the point, like there's too many points to plot because there are too many people being killed. This is the point here. Methodologically, you know, it's no less statistically sound than any other study. The data about the people derived from a national crime data set that's distributed by the federal government. They do this thing with projected lifespans that come from a model that comes from the World Health Organization that takes into account all sorts of demographic and geographic information. But it was really viewed with suspicion from the visualization community because it made us feel. So a feminist approach here would say that's not a problem at all, that it made us feel things. And actually, it's a more compelling visualization precisely because it blends reason with emotion. And what you get when you allow yourself to rebalance emotion and reason is really just a much wider data communication toolbox that allows you to focus on what really matters in a design process. So honoring context, listening to experience, and taking action to challenge these imbalances of power that we encounter in the world. So, in case it's not already apparent, the principles of data feminism apply to every stage of a data science project, from inception to funding to production to circulation and impact in the world. Which brings me actually to the final point that I want to make before the Q&A, which actually may already be obvious from these examples. But it's that data feminism insists on an expanded definition of what data science entails. You know, our idea of data science isn't defined by the size of the data set or the credentials of the people undertaking the work, because these concerns are continually and historically used to exclude women and people of color from technical fields. And they're actually, for that matter, also used to exclude work that makes a contribution that is socio-technical rather than purely technical or methodological. But if we expand our definition of data science, then we can clearly see that some of the most exciting work in data science today is being undertaken by artists, by journalists, by humanists, by community organizers, by activists. You know, and some of this work does look like traditional data science. And here we just sort of want to give a shout out to some of the work that is actually on this slide. So you see on the top left a paper by Margaret Mitchell, actually, who is the other co-director of the ethical AI group at Google that I began by talking about. This is an earlier paper. but it's on bias and natural language processing. That's what you see on the far left. But in the middle, for instance, you see an example of an interactive AI sculpture by the artist Stephanie Dinkins, which was trained on an intergenerational dialogue between Black women and her family. So it's a small data set, but that uses AI. It sort of works like an Amazon Echo, and you can interact with it and have conversations with it. And then on the right, you see a kind of inventive and fun data journalism project by the group The Pudding that examines gender bias in Hollywood screenplays. And The Pudding does a lot of fun data journalism that takes on issues of gender and race, among other topics, on their website. And then below, you see a project by the group Data Therapy. And what they do is they work with community-based organizations to first analyze and then design and then finally paint what they call data murals that demonstrate the sort of what is going on in their community on the basis of the data that they themselves have collected. You know, we have hundreds of examples like this in the book, in which we selected because we tried to both illustrate our points and inspire readers of the book to action. You know, the thing that I just want to close by saying before I sum up is, you know, one of the things that we try to emphasize in the book is that, you know, we recognize that data is at the root of so many problems today, many problems, but data can also be part of the solution. And so what we try to do in the book is to provide some examples of what some of that preliminary work would look like. So more concretely, some specific things that you can do. And this is intended sort of for students and scholars and people in sort of academic and academic adjacent roles. Do work that interrogates and exposes sexism, racism, and other forces of oppression. Examine how these forces show up in data and in the world. Collect counter data and missing data. Introduce new communities to data science and data tools. Use data to advocate for equity at your institution. And this is something that I find actually myself doing an increasing amount of work with my students, because if there's an environment which you know really well, it is your own. And there's a lot of data that doesn't exist, that should exist, that you, we can collect. Experiment with creative forms of data presentation and communication. So quilts, sculptures, VR, fashion shows. People in data-driven projects, especially impacted communities. Center the work of minoritized people, and importantly, follow their leadership. And then make sure you credit your sources and research support staff. Make your process transparent and reflect on your own identity. I also wanted to direct your attention, in case you wanted a sort of more colorful version of essentially the distillation of this talk. Catherine and I recently worked with the designer Marcia Diaz, and we created these data feminism infographics and then some individual postcards, one for each principle. And you can download them from our website. We have them in currently 5 languages, Korean, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. And then we have Greek and Turkish in the works. I think that's all for my formal remarks. There's more information about Catherine and our own research on our individual websites, on the websites of our lab groups. Catherine runs the Data Plus Feminism Lab at MIT. I run the Digital Humanities Lab. It used to be at Georgia Tech. I'm in the process of moving it over to Emory. We're both on Twitter more than we should be. Catherine is on Instagram. You can find me on GitHub. And those are the ways to get in touch. So perfect. So that's all for my formal remarks. And I'm just really interested to hear your questions.
Well, this is the point at which we would all thank Dr. Klein for her amazing talk. So let's do that in our own way individually. We're now going to transition into the Q&A portion, and we have about 20 minutes left for that. Just a reminder that you can submit your questions via a form that we have, and Samantha will continue to drop that into the chat so we can keep the questions rolling in. Our first question comes from Hannah Rose Schell, who is in the Art and Art History and Cinema Studies department.
I can't see you.
And she points out that your book, Data Feminism, is not only an ambitious work, it's also a very ambitious collaboration.
So she is curious to learn more about what collaboration looks like for you. And if you could just speak more about your collaborative process.
Sure. Thanks for that question. I love talking about this process because I think collaboration is really important. It makes things better almost across the board, and yet it's really, really hard. Catherine and I come from two pretty different backgrounds. I think we're allied in the fact that both of us took sort of circuitous paths to where we are. And so we both of us have an appreciation for sort of how unrelated and disparate ideas can inform each other. But I ended up in a place where I do primarily historical work in the humanities, layered in with computational and quantitative methods. And Catherine ended up in design and HCI, so doing a lot of participatory work. And for actually, both of us switched institutions right as this book was going to press, but she used to be in a journalism department. I used to be sort of in an interdisciplinary applied media studies department. Now we're in entirely different places, but that's neither here nor there. And so while, I think because we're both, technically adept, we were able to sort of deal with the logistics of collaboration very easily. We worked on Google Docs. We just constantly iterated over the text obsessively a lot. A lot of the work, and I think part of the reason why we've been happy that the book has found a lot of audiences is that we had to do a lot of translational work sort of between each other. Things that I thought were important or clear, like I'm a big theory head and I can really get into the weeds with some like pretty jargony stuff. And Catherine would be saying like, well, do we need to have all of that? Like, can't you just sort of say it more simply or tell people what they're supposed to do after they learn about this theoretical framework? And so she was sort of constantly keeping on me to sort of speak clearly and sort of make it actionable. And similarly, she would sort of present these examples of like things that had happened right now. And I would always say like, I think there's like a longer history to that thing. And so I would go in and add some footnotes. And I think we ended up complementing each other really, really well. So I don't know if that helps to answer your question, but it definitely was, I had not undertaken a project that was collaborative between a person who was so different, whose background was so different, or sort of intellectual background was so different from my own before, but it's clearly the project that has benefited the most, I would say, from precisely because of that.
We have a note from Hannah that yes, that did help answer her question. And I believe Samantha has the next one.
Awesome, thank you. So our next question comes from Marjorie Mitchell at the University of British Columbia, and they would like to know, has any one area of data feminism had more impact or had more widespread acceptance? Could you maybe speak to the uptake of data feminism that you've seen in this field of information science or anywhere else?
That's a really good question. Let's see. I think the interest in the project, I think, sort of speaking generally, has been showing how feminism sort of isn't just about ladies. I think that that's, people who aren't well versed in feminist theory or feminist activism sort of don't really know this broad background that it draws from. And so it's actually been really rewarding to explain to people both sort of what feminism can do, but also why feminism matters. And I think that sort of most consistently, those are some of the comments that we get. People say like, well, I used to think that was just sort of doing good data science, and or like, how come this isn't just critical data studies? And we'd have to say, no, feminism really, especially intersectional feminism, draws from this fundamental starting point where you begin by looking at sort of forces of power in the world and how they essentially overdetermine all of the work that you do, and you start there always. And so that's sort of one thing that I think has resonated pretty widely. I will say, okay, so I'll say a flip side. One thing that's been really tricky that I'm very invested in is this question of documenting labor, which everyone agrees that we need to do, but is incredibly hard in practice, right? And so I think there's still a big gulf between what everyone knows is required, like documenting all of the people and all the processes that are involved in any particular project, and the reality that we do not have the tools or the models or even the capacity to keep track, or in times even begin to identify some of the people and processes that are involved.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think Jordan has the next one.
Yeah, so we actually have several questions on a similar theme. So this is coming in from Morgan Scheuerman, who's in our Department of Information Science, and then also Randy Pyers in Faculty Affairs. And these questions are around how we operate as individuals working within larger institutions and how we might apply these principles. So Morgan asks, how can we encourage buy-in of data feminism of both individual engineers and researchers working within larger tech companies? And then I'm sorry, this was Liz from CSU, who's curious about people who are incorporating this within universities or other larger institutions that may be resistant to these ideas.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think there's a real, like in general, there's a real tension between sort of what you can do at the individual level and then the opposition or harm that you might face, and then sort of what you need broader support in order to accomplish. And I think that, you know, one of the points that, and again, this is sort of speaking very broadly, but one of the really basic sort of positions of feminism is that you should reject the idea that it's always an either or choice, right? That like, because you're only doing what you, because, you know, you would need a collective in order to do more impactful work, you shouldn't do the work that you can accomplish on your own. Or alternately, that because there's this larger thing, this movement going on, that they don't really need you individually to sort of go off on your own and to explore your thing. And I think one of the things we try to make clear in the book is that there's a place for all of this kind of work. And in the end, it all meets up, right? And everyone, as long as people are invested in a shared goal, then it is okay if, you know, you can only change what you teach in your class and the rest of the department rejects it. Or that, you know, you want to change the reporting structure of your team and the rest of your organization does something else. At the same time, that can be exhausting and draining. And as we saw, again, you know, to bring this back to Dr. Gebru, like it can actually have real impact on your lives. And so just practically speaking, sort of finding your people within any organization, because they do exist. That's just a really important coping mechanism, I think, and ultimately allows this kind of sort of more, constrained isn't the right word, but like sort of delimited work that is sort of what you can touch in your own way. It allows you to keep on going if you have other people that you can sort of turn to for community and support.
Great, that was an awesome answer. Okay, so the next question we have speaks a little or asks a little bit more about specific types of data being gathered. They didn't leave their name, but this person's a PhD student, and they asked, what are your thoughts on the use of binary gender classification methods in scientific research that attempts to uncover and understand inequalities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one that is sort of endemic to all social science research, right? You know, so much of the data that we have to work with uses only binary gender categories. And in many cases, especially at the graduate student level, like you can't control that, right? You work with the data that you have. And so a couple of things to say about this. First is to acknowledge that there are people not being counted in this type of data collection. And so the end goal is obviously to collect gender data more robustly in ways that represents the communities that you're, or even the larger populations that you're attempting to represent. On a practical note, I feel like I'm going in two different ways here, but I want to say one thing that's very practical before I move into sort of the aspirational. On a practical note, one thing you can do is just note that. Like if you're dealing with data that you yourself did not collect, or even that you did collect that only uses binary gender categories, you can just note that, you know, any analysis that you produce, you can just add a little sentence that says the study did not consider non-binary genders. And actually this suggestion was given to us during the peer review phase by a grad student, actually, Nikki Stevens, who I think is at Arizona State, who's working on intersectional data collection. You know, we put, I forget if I mentioned this in the earlier question about collaboration, but we put a draft of the book online for an open peer review process where it was just open to anyone on the internet to comment. And we were very terrified about what would happen, but it turned out that people were very nice. But one of the things that emerged was that because of the focus on projects that engage questions of gender, and because of the way in which most gender data is collected, most of the projects that we talked about in the book mostly just dealt with binary gender. And this is an omission and an oversight. And we weren't really sure what to do. And then Nikki went through and said, like, all you just say it, just say it. Just note that this is as far as you can take the results. But there's missing data here. And I actually have continued to implement that policy in future, in additional projects moving forward in all sorts of fields. And it just takes a sentence or two, but it's really helpful in calling attention to the incompleteness of that data. But that brings me just to the last thing I want to say about this, which connects to a point that I sort of made in passing at the beginning, which is that collecting specific data about particular groups, especially groups that are vulnerable, is not always the best solution in all contexts. And sometimes you don't even need gender data in the first place. And this is because even in large populations and data that represents them, non-binary genders are still like a pretty small percentage of that overall data set. And so you could actually be drawing specific attention to individuals, and depending on where that data travels after you collect it, could bring harm upon those people. And so it's really important to ask yourself, like, why do I need this information? Will it help me produce the results that I'm after? And if it has something to do with, like, health or, like issues that we know affect folks, non-binary folks more directly, then like by all means collect that data. But in most cases, you don't need to collect data, gender data at all for like most purposes in life. And actually, Oliver Hamison, I think, has some great work on this. That's sort of, it's like a checklist of like, do you need to collect gender data? If yes, this is how you do it. If no, stop here. And you sort of go through this, process in order to make sure that you're collecting the data that you need in an ethical and accurate way.
Thank you. We're also getting several questions about how to incorporate some of these principles into teaching practices. So Shannon Sheridan from the University of Wyoming wants to know if you have any suggestions for incorporating these into teaching or workshops, and what methods you found to be effective for discussing this with diverse audiences. And then we also had a question from Eric Vance, who's curious about how you've used any of these principles to teach data science differently in your own teaching practice.
Sure. I mean, I'll say sort of as a general comment that we wrote this book to be taught. We had a couple of sort of core audiences in mind, and one of them was students who sort of wanted to do, data for social good, but sort of wanted more direction as to how precisely. So we really tried to speak to that particular audience. In terms of more specific techniques, I've taught out of data feminism in 2 contexts, soon to be 3. So I have a weird joint appointment between a data science department where I teach methods courses, and then an English department where I teach critical analysis and things like this. And so I've taught both a class on feminist data science. It's on GitHub. If you Google my GitHub and you find the course, you can look at it. But essentially it was like a chapter of data feminism, some recent papers that I thought engaged those issues, and then a lab that sort of worked through, so you could sort of see how some of these issues showed up when you were actually working with data, whether it was with respect to classification or prediction or other modeling issues or whatever. I've also sort of subtly introduced this kind of thinking into, I teach like a text analysis, computational text analysis, or a methods course where it's just like a new method every day. You just like, it's pretty brutal for the students, because like you just march through all the things that you can do with text as data. But I've tried both to sort of frame the course, and I inherited the course from a CS professor who was sort of much like really strictly focused on methods. But I now frame the course in the beginning by talking a little bit about sort of where data comes from. And at the end, I talk a little bit in terms of validation, sort of like, what does it mean to validate results? And what does that really mean when you're dealing with real data in the world that impacts people? And then I also, along the way, just try to pick data sets that are interesting and topical, and try to bring some of these issues into play, whether this is, like sentiment analysis, right? Where you can talk about like context matters with sentiment analysis, and you can pick some examples that show why like it is a little bit more impactful other than like spam or not spam, or some other examples, working with historical documents, things like this. And I've also found, though, that this is more of a an answer that you probably were expecting for, but we're actually just in the process of scheduling our classes for the fall. So I've been thinking a lot about this. But I've also found that non-technical students, especially in the humanities, actually can do a lot of this kind of counter data and feminist data collection work, because it tends to be small data, categories informed by lived experience and sort of knowledge of a particular subject. And I found myself increasingly moving away from like a data studies type approach in my more humanities classes, where in the past we would just say like, let's look at these examples and talk about why Google is bad. And now actually leading my students in more sort of procedural type assignments that don't seem sort of Englishy, but they're totally into and can do, and I think are pretty powerful.
Great. So we have another 2 questions here, more about you as a researcher. So this one was submitted anonymously, but they ask, how do you as a white researcher negotiate the fact that you are researching and in certain ways benefiting from your white privilege? Are you not furthering the same inequalities you study? And then Estelle Smith from CU Boulder, who's a postdoc here, submitted a question along similar lines where she would like you to share any information that you feel comfortable with about your personal journey arriving to the point where you could write this book.
Sure. So I really appreciate those questions. And I have to say, I have been waiting for this question for a year, and this is the first person to actually ask it. So I don't know if it was just like the Google Docs where people felt authorized or what. But that first question, it's a huge question. And it's one that Catherine and I grappled with a lot and talked a lot about. And, and this connects to the second question about sort of how I got here. And sort of how we arrived at this point. But so maybe I'll answer the first question first, because I tend to get off subject, as you can tell. But I will say that, Catherine and I, it's a challenging question because, you are who you are and the position that you occupy is the one that you have. But Catherine and I believe very strongly that an intersectional feminist approach was what was necessary in order to do this work. And, as I said at the beginning of the talk, sort of is required when talking about feminism in the year 2021, as it has been historically. And so there was sort of not a way that we couldn't draw from the work of Black scholars and call attention to racial in particular and equity generally in the process of this work, because that was the intervention that we felt was required. But what we did do was try to hold ourselves accountable. And we did this a couple of different ways. First of all, like we just did the homework, and I believe in this, like through all of my work. And maybe this connects to the second question. Like my historical work is on the 18th century and the legacies of the Enlightenment, which is fundamentally connected to slavery and sort of all of the roots of the racism that is pervasive today. And so working on this historical work, when you're dealing with stories and narratives written by enslaved Black people as a white researcher, you always need to be asking yourself, like, who am I and what is my relationship to this text? And sort of holding that in your mind always. But I think part of that is just sort of making sure that you know what you're talking about and you have learned from and you cite the scholars, especially Black scholars who have done this work before. Catherine and I tried to keep metrics on the scholars and the examples that we included in the book, not actually wholly successfully, which I can talk about a little bit later. We also tried to, half of the profits from the book go to some community groups that we feel strongly about, which are connected to issues of racial justice, not wholly focused on, but so we tried to sort of do what we can. And I think, just speaking honestly, like, this is the situation that we're in. Like, this is an all hands on deck type situation where we are confronted at a national and international level with sort of the ravages of white supremacy, and everyone needs to get on board with this, right? And the answer, I think, is not to walk away because, again, to get to a question that I talked about at the beginning, because it's uncomfortable, and it tends to be more uncomfortable for white people, I think, to grapple with their own roles in this. But to just sort of do the work and to reflect and to be open, I think, to criticism. And I think also to sort of adopt a stance that makes it clear that you will be okay if someone tells you that you are doing it wrong. And I think that that can be, can feel, it's a sort of a new position again for people who are usually tend to be sort of associated with dominant groups. It's a new position to be in, because if you're not, you get told you're doing it wrong, whether you ask for it or not. But anyway, I'm glad this question got asked. I think there's a complicated answer. I don't think it's a perfect answer, but I think these are all these things that you can constantly be doing and recalibrating as you move through, so that you can hold yourself accountable when you're trying to be a part of this kind of work. I don't know if you want me, Jordan, to sort of talk about the previous question, or if I see it's 5 o'clock right now. So
we are at 2 o'clock, so I think maybe a few brief thoughts on that, and then we'll hand it back over to Thea, who will close us out.
Sure. Yeah. So I mentioned a little bit in passing my training. I worked as a software developer before I went to grad school. So that, and I took some CS classes in college. So that's sort of where my technical training mostly comes from. But my degree is in English, my PhD. I'm trained as in the literature of the 18th and 19th centuries, primarily in the United States, but extending to the Atlantic world. And this is essentially where a lot of the historical roots and philosophies that sort of have given rise to our data-driven culture come from. So Enlightenment thinking was sort of what brought about this idea of experiential knowledge, of quantifying that knowledge, of creating knowledge out of sort of how we live and interact in the world. And that accelerated over the sort of late 16th, 17th, and 18th century, sort of arriving at the birth of modern statistics. And then sort of coinciding also, there's a parallel strain of ideas about visual knowledge, which again, are wholly connected to questions of race, and race being a visual thing that you can see, and this belief in the primacy of what you can see, which again sort of culminate in data visualization as a practice. And those, they sort of converge in the late 18th century, but they were sort of running on parallel courses before. And so, as someone who sort of for a long time has used computational methods in my work, and also sort of known the history, I've always wanted to bring those two things together. And so this project really represents my attempt to try to situate the methods that we use now in sort of these broader questions of power, and especially race and gender, but also sort of show how they didn't just sort of appear in a vacuum, right? It's not just a phenomenon that we're dealing with right now. This is the culmination of several centuries of sort of dominant Enlightenment thought that has pushed science as a discipline into viewing data and data collection and data analysis as a kind of thing that can be performed in only in a particular way by a particular kind of people for a particular audience. And there's a whole other world out there if we sort of expand our view.
Well, it's 3:03, and I'd just like to thank Professor Klein again for a really wonderful presentation and thoughtful answers to our questions, and also to Jordan and Samantha for moderating the Q&A. For the CU Boulder students who RSVP'd for the small group discussion with Professor Klein, please look in your email for the Zoom link to attend. And thanks everyone for your interest in the webinar and for your attendance today.
Thank you so much for listening.